So today's daf is Nun Hey. We are 11 lines from the top of Nun Hey Amud Aleph. We're getting back into the halacha now. Now the basic topic of today's shiur is going to be, just to give an overview, is going to be how we determine tichumin. So we know that we determine the border of the city. 2,000 amot outside of the border of the city is where you're not allowed to go. So what the Mishnah talked about was that if you have, for example, a circular-shaped city, a circular-shaped town, so the way that we draw the tichum is we don't take a circle, but we draw a square around it. So you can see in the picture in the Rashi here on top what that would look like. That there's a circle with a square, and now the square is going to be the real tichum. We're not going to make a circular tichum. We're not going to measure from each point on the circle, so to speak, 2,000 amot from this point, 2,000 amot from this point, 2,000 amot from this point. Instead, we're going to make it square, and from the square line, we determine the extent of the tichum. That's a certainly more efficient way of doing it, first of all, because otherwise, from every point of departure, you're going to have a different tichum, which is going to be a mess. But that's how the halacha is established, and we learned that from some cases in the Torah where it talks about the cities of the Levi'im and so on. Now, the Gemara says, Tanu Rabbanan, we learned that the rabbis taught, how do we establish the tichum in cities that are unconventionally shaped? So, aruka kemot. So if you have a long city, we establish it as it is. In other words, it's long, but it's rectangular. So we don't force it into a square shape, is what the Gemara is going to explain. Okay, we take it as it is. Agula osin lazaviot. If it's circular, we make corners for it. As we said, we draw a square around it. Mirubaat en osin lazaviot. If it's square, we don't make corners for it. Of course, what is the Gemara going to ask? That's obvious. If it's square, it already has corners. So why would you need to make corners around it? Let's say you have a situation where it is wide on one side, but it narrow on the other side. So we look at it as if it's completely, or hi shava. We look at it as if it's completely equal. In other words, we draw the line from the thick part. So if you were to have, let's say, imagine almost a triangular sort of structure, we're going to take the thick part and draw it out to make it square.
So you have 490 degree angles.
Okay, so yeah, you're going to end up, you always have 490 degree angles, exactly. So if you have a situation where it's wide on one side and narrow on the other, you're going to have to fill out the side that's narrow and make it square. Turn it into a rectangle. Okay, so, or a quadrilateral, I guess, but specifically one that has either a rectangle or a square, it seems to be. Now, okay, so that's how you do it. Now, let's say one house was protruding. So everything is perfectly lined up, but one house is sticking out. Or you have two protrusions from the city. So what's amazing is that what you end up having is one protrusion out from the city changes the configuration of the entire thing, because we have to draw the line around it, and we're not going to make a jagged edge like this. We're not going to draw down and then go around the house and then draw the line around the rest of the houses, but rather we're going to draw it down to the furthest house, make a straight line at a right angle going in the other direction. So what ends up happening is that one house that protrudes from one side of the city or one side of the town is actually going to extend that entire side of the city a large amount of space. So let's see if they have a picture of that here. Do they have a picture of that here? No, they have a picture of the city that's narrow on one side and thick on the other side, but they don't have a picture of this. But we get the idea. In fact, in Rashi it has it. In Rashi it has a picture of mine over here. So that has the one house is sticking out, so you have to draw the line here, so you end up getting all this extra space. Right. Okay, so that's a benefit to have the uneven development.
So they call that space pagum?
The pagum means like a thing sticking out. Right. That's what it means here, at least. Let's say you have a city that is made, or a town that's shaped like a bow. In other words, it's shaped like a rainbow. O kimin gam, or like the Greek letter gam, which looks kind of like a backwards daled. Okay, in Hebrew. So if you have a shape like that, so then so what you have to do is you have to imagine as if the entire thing is filled with houses. So let's say here, you have on, this is illustrations number 194 and 195. So you have a space, you have the bow shape, and then you have in here, it's blank, it's empty. But what do? You draw a line here. You close this off. Over here, what do? Where it's shaped like the backwards Dalet. So what you do is you make another square in here, basically, to complete the square of the entire city, and that way you have a tikkun. But the point is that there's no space in here, but we imagine as if this space is a part of the city.
After you fill this space in the bow, what do you do about this? Do you still draw a square or rectangle?
So it's interesting because it doesn't talk about drawing a square or rectangle in that case, in the case of the bow.
The half circle way.
So it seems to be like an exception to the rule because it never talks about drawing a square in that case. It only talks about drawing a square where you have uneven quadrilateral, or where you have a quadrilateral like this where it's narrow on one end and wide on the other, or where you have a circle. But it never really talks about making a square when you have a bow. Because I guess, you would think on this side it should be squared, right?
Right.
Yeah, but it never talks about that, so I'm not exactly clear on how they handle the other side. This side, they make it straight. The open side of the bow, they make straight. But what about the other side? Why does that not have to be made into a square as well? It would seem like it should. So let's leave that up for further research. It doesn't talk about it, though. Amar, the master said, Aruka kimot shehi. If you have a long city or town, you leave it as it is. So pshita, that's obvious. I mean, if it's in a square shape, we already said a square shape is sufficient. So what does it matter if it's long or not? Lo tzricha de'aricha uktina. The point is where you have a rectangular shape. In other words, two sides are shorter than the long sides. The long sides are long, and the two sides on and you have two short sides. So so you might think we should make it equal. We should make it into a square. So you would transform your rectangle into a square. And you would extend the short sides to make them longer, so that it would be equal. So kamash malan. So therefore, we learn from here that aruka kimot shehi, that if it's long, we leave it as it is. Okay. So next case, mirubaat in osin lazaviot. We said if it's square, we don't make corners. So pshita, that's obvious. Why would you need squares? Why would you need to make corners if the thing is already square? Lo tzrichad de mirba'a velo mirba'a. So velo mirba'a biribua olam. Where it's square, but it's not square according to the corners of the earth. What does that mean? It means that instead of it being a square where there's a north side and a south side and a west side and an east side, it's on an angle, it's diagonal. So what you end up having is, let's say, a northeast point and a south and a southwest or whatever. So let's take a look at the illustration. Or is there a Rashi here that shows it? No. So let's take a look at the illustration that they have back here to show what that means. In other words, the point is that it doesn't correspond. Here we go. So it's on an angle. So that the point on top, instead of a side being an eastern side, there's a point at the east, a point at the west, a point at the south, and a point at the north. And the sides themselves are diagonal with the directions. There's a northwest side, there's a southwest side, there's a southeast side, and there is a northeast side. So the question is, do we have to draw the square according to the directions of the world? Okay, having a north side, a south side, a west side, and east side. And the answer is no, you don't have to do that. As long as the shape is square, we don't care if the square corresponds to the directions of the world. Kamash malan, therefore we learn that we don't have to do that. If you had some kind of house that protrudes from the development like a type of tower, or you have two protrusions. So wait a second, the statement already told us that if you have one house protruding, we draw the line, we extend the border past that house. We don't draw the line around the individual house, but we extend the border past that house. So why do we need to know when you have two houses? It should be obvious. When you have one house that protrudes, so then certainly if you have two. So the answer is because you might have thought that, let's say you have a protrusion on one side and then you have a protrusion on the other side. You might say, well, I can do it on one side, but how can I on both sides extend the border of the city on both sides because of one house on one side and one house on the other side? Maybe I can only do that on one of the two sides. So the answer is, even if you have it on two different sides, you can extend the border on all the sides just because of one house. So if you have a bow-shaped or a gum-shaped development, of houses. So then you imagine it as if it's full with houses and chatzerot and courtyards. Umodid mimena ulahalan alpaim ama, and you measure from there 2,000 amot. Amar Rav Huna said, Ir ha'asuya kekeshetim yesh ben shnei rashea pachot me'arba'at alafim ama modidin la min hayeter ve'im lav modidin la min hakeshet. So he said like this: if you have a situation where you have a bow, now the bow is the shape of the bow. The town looks like this.
Matos just left. He
just left.
Just left, like 5 minutes ago.
He probably walked. Yeah. So, if you have a bow shaped like this, so if this side and this side are within 4,000 amot of one another, so then we draw an imaginary line from one to the other, and we measure the techum, we measure the space going out. But if this end of the bow, this side of the bow on the right side, and the left side of the bow are more than 4,000 amot apart, okay, that means that they themselves are separated by more of a techum, because there's a 2,000 amat techum from here to here, and there's a 2,000 amat techum from the right towards the middle, and there's a 2,000 amat techum from the left to the middle, right?
Even though it's all the same town.
So even though it's all the same town, but then you can't unite the ends of the keshet, the ends of the bow. Now you might be able to unite them from here, from the middle maybe. In other words, the point is you have to be able to draw a line from one side to the other that's less than 4,000 amot, since there's space in between. Now you might be able to do that on the end of the town, or you might have to do that from the middle of the town. If you do that from the middle of the town, then these houses on the end have their own techum. The houses on the end have their own techum, and you're just going to measure it from here. Okay, so let's see if they have a color picture that illustrates this more vividly in the back. So if you have 4,000, so this is illustration number 198. If you have this side of the town and this side of the town are less than 2,000 amot, 4,000 amot apart, so then you draw an imaginary line from here, and the people from the town, even if you live here, you get this extra space, because we're not going to count the techum until you reach that line. Now let's see if they have a picture of the other situation. No, they don't. Okay. So that's what Rav Huna is saying. Now, Umi Amar Rav Huna Hachi, and Rav Huna really said this. Rav Huna said, Chomat ha'ir shenifritza b'me'ah v'arba'im v'achat b'shalish, that if you have a city that's broken in half, basically, that you had a complete city, and Rashi has an illustration on the side of what that looks like, and then it was broken down the middle, and the breakage in the middle is 141 and a third amah going down the middle, so then they're considered two cities. Okay? If they're less than that amount, in other words, if they're within that amount, they're considered one city. If it's more than 141 and a third amot, they're considered two separate cities now. So they would each one have their own, let's say, techum, their own border.
Like with the tail.
Okay, because they're separate. If they're so close that they're united, then they would be united. In other words, so for instance, let's say in the one side, on the right side city, there was some protrusion that was further out than the left side city. So that would only count for the techum of the right side city if they're two different cities. If they're one city, then a protrusion, even from just the right side, will have to be accounted. The whole thing is going to have one techum. So if you separate them, then each one is evaluated on its own. If you put them together, then we evaluate them as one. So whatever counts for one is going to count for the other.
So if one side is further than the other, then it's not a straight line. It's like a
no, it's not. Like, let's say the right side one has a little house here.
Right.
Okay, and these are two separate cities. So in this techum, we're going to count from down here. Right. But in this one that doesn't have the protrusion, we're going to count from here. But if they're all one city, then even if only this side has a protrusion, we're going to count the entire.
Oh, I see. But the whole thing is enclosed into one.
Now it's separate.
Oh, it's separate. Okay.
The question is, how much is it separated? Is it separated enough that now we have to evaluate each one on its own?
Oh, how far?
Or right, how far does the separation in the middle have to be? Okay, so so the question is, since Rav Huna said that if you have a separation of 141 and a third, that's considered a separation. So why here is he saying with the two sides of the bow that 4,000 amot is still considered together?
So it's not like
less than 4,000, right? So how can he say that? Amar Rabbi Bar Ula says, Lo kasher kan beruach achat, kan mishtei ruchot, because the city that's separated is separated completely through. On both sides. It's totally divided. The one of the keshet is still united in the back, right? The back of the bow is still one piece. it's only on the ends that you see a separation between the two. And maybe if you live on the left side of the curvature of the bow, you're going to say, oh, I don't really feel like I'm in the same neighborhood as the guy on the other curve. Right? Imagine a big street that curves around like this. You don't see the other side of the street, let's say. So you feel that you're in a different neighborhood. So that's the way he's imagining it. But still, they're connected. So it's harder to disconnect something that's actually physically connected. In the back, they're connected by the bow. It's only on the ends that they're disconnected. Oh my kamashmalan, what is he teaching you? What we're showing you is that you give a karpaf to both. In other words, where did he get this number of 141 and a third? Because really, what is the halacha? That each city is entitled to what's called a karpaf. A karpaf means 70 amot and change, basically, is given to each city in front of it. So even when you measure the tchum, even if you were to measure the tchum of the city, you were to measure the where is the border of the city, you always give a city 70 and a little bit more amot, because that's called the karpaf of the city, like the outskirt of the city. So when you have these two cities that are broken down the middle, it was originally one city and you broke it down the middle. So if you give the one on the right 70 amot and a little bit more, and you give the one on the left 70 amot and a little bit more, so then in between, their outskirts overlap. Right? Because the outskirt of this one is 70 and somewhat more, and the one on this one is 70 and somewhat more. So they meet in the middle. So they're all still united by their outskirts. But if there's more than 141 and a third amot between them, so that means that even if you give outskirts to the one on the right and outskirts to the one on the left, they're not going to meet in the middle. They're two separate cities. Okay, so that's the way that he explains it. Now, Rav Huna doesn't know, but this seems superfluous because Rav Huna already told us this idea. As we learned in the Mishnah, Rabbi Meir says you give a karpaf to the city, you give the outskirts to the city as well. That the only time we give a karpaf, in other words, according to Rabbi Meir, even when we normally measure the tchum of a city, we give it a karpaf. But the rabbis say, no, that's only in between two cities. To unite them, we'll say, okay, this one gets a karpaf and this one gets a karpaf. But we don't normally give them a karpaf. In other words, just in front of, let's say you just had one sole city by itself, and you want to determine the tchum. You want to know what is the distance, what is the border of the city. So you don't give it an extra 70 amot. You measure from the last house. But if there were two cities adjacent to one another and you want to combine them into one city for tchum purposes, so then if they have a space in between them of less than 141 and a third, we're going to give it to them. Yeah, ve'itmar Rav Huna, Amar Rav Huna said, karpaf lazo, we give a karpaf to each one. V'chia bar Rav Amar, ein notnim ela karpaf achad l'shnehem. According to so you have a machloket. Rav Huna is the one who says you give 70 and something to the one on the right, 70 and something to the one on the left, and they combine together. According to according to Chia bar Rav, you only give 70 amot and change. You don't give one to the one on the right and one to the one on the left, but they have to be within 70 amot of each other, the two cities. Rav Huna is allowing you 140 and 141 amot. So that's the machloket. But we see already that Rav Huna already told us this idea about the separation of the cities. So why does he have to tell it to us first in the statement that we had before? There was a freestanding statement about the two cities that are broken in half. About the city that's broken in half, he tells us. And he tells us about the two cities that are adjacent. Why did Rav Huna have to tell us twice? Once about the two cities that are adjacent to one another, that as long as they're within 141 amot, they're still considered one city. And to tell us that when a city is broken down the middle, as long as it's less than 141 amot, we're still good. It's still considered one. Why did you have to tell us twice? Tzricha was necessary because if we only had one, that's because mishum dahava leitzad heter meikara avalatam emalo. Because here we have already somewhat of a heter. We have something of a basis for leniency. Why? Because it was already one city. We're disrupting, we're breaking a city. So maybe Rav Huna said you have 141 amot because he doesn't want to break up a city that was once a unity. However, but when it comes to two cities that are separate, maybe he would agree with Chia bar Rav and say, why should we give them more than 70 amot? If they're more than 70 amot separate, they're two separate cities. And if you tell me in the case of the two cities, that's because he might say that each city is an independent city. And because it's an independent city, each one is entitled to 70 amot of its own. So that's why he allows you 141. However, but here, how can you say that each city is entitled to its own karpaf? There were one city before. That area was filled with houses before. It was just demolished. So how can you say they need to have 70 each? Right? So therefore, so that's why you need both cases. In other words, you need the case of the two cities that are already independent to tell us that even though you might argue that they shouldn't be given 70 amot each to unite them, he does allow it. And then in the case of the one city that's broken, where you might argue that why should we give them 70 amot each? They were doing just fine without it before. And yet he still allows them 70 amot each and allows them to meet in the middle and unite and stay united as one city. How much can there be between the string that you draw? Now remember, we're talking about a bow-shaped kind of thing, kind of a town. And then you draw a line, they call the yeter, the bowstring, right, across it, to define where the line is going to be that we're going to count the tchum from. So there's space in that area. So how far can it be from the actual end, if you imagine the bow? So from the bow itself, from the back of the bow, okay, to where this line is going to be, how much empty space can there actually be? Because remember, you're allowing the people, let's say, who live in the back of the bow to walk all the way up to that line and then even further than that line. In other words, if you live in this part of the city, okay, all the way here, you're going to be allowed to walk all the way to this line and you're still not even starting the tchum yet, and then you can go 2,000 amot.
So what's the limit?
Right, so what's the limit from here, from the actual edge of the town, to here, is the question. And so the Gemara says that Rava, so you have Rabba bar Rav Huna Amar al Paim Amah. Rabba bar Rav Huna says, listen, my limit is 2,000 amot. If there's more than 2,000 amot from the actual back of that bow, in other words, where the houses stop in the curvature of the bow, to the bow string that we're the imaginary string that we're drawing, if there's 2,000 amot, more than 2,000 amot, forget it. Because the person who lives at the edge of the actual residential area in the curve walks 2,000 amot already to the line. That's too much. However, Rava Bereid Rabba bar Rav Huna, his son, his own son, Rabba bar Rav Huna's son Rava said, Afilu yeter me'alpayim amah, even if it's more than 2,000 amot. In other words, there's no limit, and that's what the halacha is. Amar Abaye says, Kivatei de Rava Bereid Rava bar Rav Huna mistabra. Actually, it makes the most sense according to Rava, the son of Rabba bar Rav Huna. Why? The Ibae hadar atei derech batim. Because there's a very simple reason. As you drew this line, right? And what's the problem that Rabba bar Rav Huna has? That if I live in the curve, I have to walk 2,000 amot just to get to the line. So how can I make this the line? But what does Abaye say? Abaye says it makes more sense that there's no limit. Why not? Because let's say I want to go there. I can always walk around here in the residential area and I'm up to the line.
Right.
I don't have to ever leave the residential area. I'll just walk around the curve in the residential area to the line.
To the line, right.
So what's the problem?
Yeah.
See, so therefore he says it makes more sense that there's no need to worry about the space from the furthest point in the curve to the line.
Right.
You don't have to look at it that way. Okay, so now, Hayusham Gidudiot Givohot Asar Tfachim. So what are Gidudiot? Ruins. So if you have ruins that are 10 Tfachim high, they can be an extension of the city. So my Gidudiot, what does Gidudiot mean? Amar Rav Yehuda says Shalosh Machaitzot She'en Alehen Tikra. If you have 3 walls, but they don't have a roof, that's considered a ruin. So 3 walls that don't have a roof that are outside the city, that's also considered like a house and can extend the Tchum past that point. They asked the following question: you told me about 3 mechitzot, 3 walls with no roof. How about the opposite? How about 2 walls with a roof? That should be good, right? So Tashma, come and listen. These are structures that can extend to the border of the city. So in other words, you have the residential area and you walk out of the residential area. And now you see one of these items, you're still in the residential area. In other words, you left where the houses are, but you see one of the following things, you're still considered to be within the residential area. What are the things? Nefesh sheyesh ba arba amot al arba amot. If you have a mausoleum, basically, or a structure that's over a grave, that's 4 amot by 4 amot, because it's designed for somebody to stay there, to guard the graves. Ve'a gesher, and a bridge, because a bridge would normally have an area for the toll collector to stay. Ve'a kever sheyesh ben bet dira, or you have a graveyard or a gravesite that has a place for people to stay to watch it. O bet knesset sheyesh ba bet dira, a synagogue that has an apartment in it. The chazan, for the chazan. Now that doesn't mean a singing chazan. Back then it meant the gabbai.
What's the sexton?
The sexton means like the gabbai, the person who manages things, the minahel of the Bet Knesset is called the chazan. Obed avodat kochavim, or a church, or some kind of a temple of idolatry, sheyesh ba bet dira lekomrim, that has residence for the priests. In other words, they don't have to be Jewish, obviously, these residences. Any residence. Ve'uravot, and you have, let's say, stables, ve'otzarot, or storehouses, shebasadot, that are in the fields, ve'yesh ben bet dira, but they have a place for some kind of house. In other words, they have some kind of a residential component to them. They have a place where a person would live. Okay, like let's say the people who work in the stables or who work in the storehouses, they have a bet dira. Or they have certain little huts that the people who worked in the fields would be in. Or you have a house on the sea. In other words, there's a little island or a little island area that the Rashi says that is within 70 amot from the city. Okay, all these things have to be within 70 amot from the city. They're in the outskirts of the city to extend the tchum of the city.
And it's 70 amot from each other. In other words,
well, not all these things are in every case. We're just saying if any of these things exist.
If you had a couple of things, if you had a church.
Yeah. You could keep extending.
So it's 70 amot.
Yeah, you could keep extending.
Uravot, what does it mean?
What?
Urva, it's urvot.
What?
Stable.
Right, stables. I don't know.
Urvot.
Why
Uravot?
I don't know. That I don't know. So in the fields, okay, or you have a house on an island, so hara elumit abrinima, they can all be included. In other words, even though the island would seem to be a separate place, a separate location, still, it's considered part of the outskirts of the city if it's within 70 amot, it's not considered a separate place. Now, so all these things extend the border of the city, and these are the things that don't extend the border of the city. If you have a mausoleum again, but it's broken on two sides, on either side. So the west and the east side are broken, for example. Or you have a cemetery, or you have a bridge that have no place for a toll collector or a person to stay. Or the synagogue doesn't have a place for someone to live. Or an idolatrous house of worship that doesn't have a place for the priests to live. And you have stables, or you have storehouses, shebasadot, that are in the field, that don't have a place for people to live. Or you have a pit, or a cistern, or a cave, or a fence, with a dovecote inside, or the house on a boat. So all of these things are not considered to be residences. We'll see what the house on the boat is. The house on the boat doesn't mean a place that's actually used for living, but it means a place that they would store stuff from the boat. Okay, so that's why it's not considered to be residential in nature. The first list was things that do extend, and these are things that are not considered residential. So in other words, not every human structure, or like let's say commercial buildings, would not count because they're not beit dira. It's not a residence. So it has to be something that's residential in nature to be able to extend the tchum. That's the basic rule. So now the question: so what's the relevance of this? So katani miad nefesh nifratza mishne ruchoteh. You said that if you have a sort of mausoleum that's broken on two sides, elach ve'elach. So what do you see? That if you have a structure that has only two walls. Right? Because we were asking, if you have two walls and a roof, this has my love the ikatikra. Isn't this something that has two walls and a roof? And it's saying that it doesn't count. It doesn't count to extend the border. No, the answer is lo the lekatikra. We could assume that it doesn't have a roof. How do you know it has a roof? It could just be a structure around the gravesite, like you find in Israel, those structures that they build around the graves of some of the tzaddikim. They're sort of like, they're enclosures. But it doesn't necessarily have a roof. So maybe it's just 2 walls without a roof. 2 walls without a roof is definitely not good. Okay, Bayit shebayam lemay chazeh. What is this house in the sea? Amar Papa, Bayit she'asui lefanot bo kelim shebasfina. That it's talking about some kind of little house that would float on the water, that you would take stuff out of the boat and put it into this little structure. It can't be a houseboat. A houseboat is a residence. Yeah. Uma'ara in, and really a cave doesn't in mitaperatima. So you're telling me that you can't extend the tichum, you can't extend the border of the city with a cave? Why not? V'atani, we learned that Rabbi Chia taught ma'araj mitaperatima that really a cave should be counted. Amar Abaye says kishiyesh binyan al piyah. It depends. If you made a structure around the cave to make it into a residence, then fine. But if it's just a stam cave anywhere, who says that's a residence? We're not cavemen. We don't live in caves.
What if you made it a residence?
But if you're going to tell me that you build a structure on the mouth of the cave, so what's the difference between that and a regular structure?
Right.
So the answer is lo tzrichal hashlim. What it means is if the cave is necessary, in other words, you built, there was a cave, and you said, you know what, this would be nice for part of my residence, but I'm going to build it into a real residence by adding on an extension. Now you made the cave into a residence. But just the natural cave that's there, a person didn't design it to be a residence. It was just there. So the fact that you're occupying it apparently doesn't make a difference. It doesn't seem to make a difference. Right.
If you occupy it, it's a residence.
Right, you would think so, but apparently you have to do something to make it into a residence. People who live in tents, in other words, gypsies or nomads or people who are Bedouins or whoever they are, who live in tents and huts and portable places, and they don't have an organized town or structure to their development of houses. So they can only, each person measures from the door of his tent 2,000 amot. There's no sense of a city. We don't say like you are in the middle. Let's say there's a trailer park. I don't know. It's like that would be the modern equivalent, maybe. Right? So you have like a bunch of tents around, and you're in the middle of the park. So you might think, well, whoever's on the edge of the park, that's where the Tuchum is going to begin. Whoever's the last row of tents is going to be where the Tuchum begins. So the Gemara is saying, no, you count from your tent. Because a temporary kind of setup, like Woodstock or something, that's not considered to be an organized town. So you can't say, well, the residents of the town that live furthest out, that's where we start counting the Tuchum. You're an independent. Everybody's for themselves in this kind of temporary situation. Mativ Rav Chisda raised an objection. He said, that when they camped, the Jewish people encamped on Beit HaYishimot by the Jordan River. Va'amar Rabbi Bar Chana said, "L'didi chazil lehahu atra v'havei tlata parsei al tlata parsei." That area that the Jews took up was 3 parsa by 3 parsa, and 3 parsa is actually 8,000. At each parsa is 8,000 amot. So 3 parsa is 24,000 amot. Okay, it's an area of 24,000 amot by 24,000 amot where they were encamped. V'tanya, and we learned in a Braita that when people had to go to the bathroom in the Midbar, what did they do? They couldn't go forward because that's towards the Aron. They couldn't go to the sides because they were surrounded by the clouds, clouds of glory. So they had to go outside of the clouds of glory. They had to go behind the camp and find a place of privacy in order to go to the bathroom. Okay, so Rashi explains they couldn't go forward because outside of the cloud that was covering them, because Shema Yeleche Anan Va'aronsha. Because if the Anan started moving, remember they never knew when it was going to start to move. The cloud starts to move, and then the Aron is going to start to move where they are. If they went to the sides also, they had to be worried that maybe it's going to move to the sides. The cloud's going to move to the sides at the minute that they're going to the bathroom. Bad timing. And the Aron's going to start moving. Rather, where did they have to go? Because they knew that they weren't going to go backwards. Once they were encamped there, they knew they weren't going to go backwards. So what did they do? They would camp. They would go behind, to the rear of where they were, so that they didn't have to worry about being caught in a compromising position. Okay? But the thing is that, what does that show you? What if you lived all the way in the front of the camp? you're going to have to walk 24,000 amot to get, okay, it's far. But that's not even the point. The point is that if you're telling me that in a temporary encampment, each person has to measure their tchum from the place that they are. They can't measure it from the edge of the furthest residence to the north. Let's say I'm just making or whatever. Well, let's say if we're talking about they were to the east, they were going to the west. So I guess the back would be the east. Let's say they can't say the furthest encampment to the east is where the Tchum begins. No, you're telling me that people who are encamped in tents, you have to count from your individual tent. So how can I walk from my individual tent 24,000 amot, or even 10,000, or even 3,000 to go outside the camp to go to the bathroom on Shabbat? I wouldn't be able to go. So what does it? Rava say, Rava says, Digle midbar kamrat. You're talking about the encampment of the wilderness. Since it says Al Pi Hashem Yachanu, they camped on the word of Hashem and they traveled by the word of Hashem. That means that wherever they are, it's considered kavua. It's considered like a permanent place. This is the same thing it talks about when we learn binyan and stira. We learn about the halachot or the malacha on Shabbat of building and dismantling from the Mishkan, even though that was always temporary. It said because it's when we talked about the moving from place to place, we talked about it always. That it was never. There were many things that they learned out from the Diglei Midbar that they said, well, because whatever they did was Al Pi Hashem Yachanu and Al Pi Hashem Yisa'u, they would do whatever they did on the word of Hashem. So it had an absolute quality to it, even though it was temporary. They weren't moving on Shabbat, right? No. They wouldn't be.
But even if they did count it as one city, still, if you're in the front, did it take you 3 hours to get?
That's true. It would take you a long time. Amar Rav Chanana said, Rav Chanana bar Rav Kahana said, Amar Rav Ashi, in the name of Rav Ashi, even if you have this hippie camp or whatever of people in the tents, still, if they have 3 courtyards of 2 houses each, that's enough to make it a development. So let's say you had in the center of this Woodstock sort of situation 2 actual houses. You had 3 enclosed areas, each of which had 2 actual houses of wood and stone, real permanent houses. So then the people encamped around it are now considered parts of that. Now they're considered part of that, and we could say they are a part of that settlement. So even the person who's furthest out will be the edge of the Tchum, and people who are closer in will not start counting their Tchum until they get to the person who's furthest out. As once you have something that's a permanent structure, then you can have outskirts. Then you can say that the people who are encamped around it are an extension of it. But when you have nothing permanent there to give you a grounding, then we can't do that. So, Amar Rav Yehuda said, Amar Rav, in the name of Rav, Yoshvei Tzarifin, Ve'olchei Midbarot, people who live in huts or tents and who travel in the wilderness or travel in the desert. Chayehen einan chayim. Their lives are not lives. Unshehen uvnehen einan shelen, and their wives and sons are not their own. We're talking about like wandering people, like Bedouins or whatever. Why? We'll see in a second. Tani Nami Hachi, we similarly learned in a Braita. Eliezer ish Birya Omer. Eliezer, the man of Birya, said, Yoshvei tzarifin ki yoshvei kevarim. That those who live in huts or these temporary tents are like people who live in graves. V'al benotehem hu omer, and about their children, he said, their daughters, he said, Arush uchevim kol behema. Cursed is the one who lies with an animal. In other words, they're considered like illegitimate children. Now, why is their life not a life? So Rashi explains, because they're exposed to the worst weather conditions. Rain, winds, they have no protection from the elements, so their life is constant suffering. And their daughters are considered illegitimate. Ma'itama, what's the reason? Because they don't have bathhouses. Meaning that the husbands would have to travel very far to go somewhere to take a shower or a bath. And that means they would leave their wives unattended, and their wives would not be faithful. Or there would be men who would come and take advantage of the wives when they weren't around. Rabbi Yochanan Amar, because the women would have to travel to the mikveh together. And when they would leave for the mikveh in groups, because they would only go together in groups because they were coming from the wilderness, men would see them and go and take advantage of them when they were away from their husbands. My benayu, what's the difference between the 2 reasons? Ika benayu nahara disamich leveta. Because if one of these encampments had next to it a river, so then you have a place for the women to go for tevilah that we don't have to be worried about. But you still have the concern that the men have to leave to go to the bathhouse. Okay, because the river is not a bathhouse. They're still going to have to leave, and they're going to leave their wives unattended, and then we don't know the status of the children. Amar Ravuna says, Kol ir ba yarak, any city that doesn't have vegetables, en Talmid Chacham rashai ladur ba. A Talmid Chacham cannot live in such a city. Really, lememra. So Rashi says, why? Because vegetables are good for your health and cheap. And that way the Talmid Chacham can buy healthy food for cheap and can spend the rest of his time learning Torah. He doesn't have to worry about spending a lot of money on healthy food because he's got vegetables. Are you telling me that vegetables are good? But we learned in a Braita, there are three things that increase the amount of waste that a person needs to eliminate. And they make a person bent over. And they take 1/500th of the light of the eyes of a person away. In other words, they're not good for your health, basically. These are them. Patz kibar, coarse bread that's not made from fine flour. As we turn to Amud Aleph, Nun Vav Amud Aleph. V'shechar chadash, and new beer that isn't aged. V'yarak, and vegetables. So that sounds like vegetables are bad for you. Yeah. So lo kashe, no problem. Ha betumei v'karte, ha b'shar yarke. Now Rashi quotes two versions. One version says that it's leeks and garlic are the bad vegetables. All other vegetables are good for you. But Rashi prefers the interpretation that leeks and garlic are what's good for you of the vegetables. The other one's not so good. That shum, garlic, is a vegetable. Kreshin, leek, is half of a vegetable. If radish is seen, then the elixir of life is seen. In other words, it's very good for you. So these three vegetables are good for you. Garlic the most, leek half as good, and radish is very good. But didn't we learn Didn't we learn in another Braita that radish is associated not with life but with death? It's a bad thing. La kashir, no problem. The difference is that when you're eating the leaves of the radish, that's not good for you. But when you eat the bulb of the radish, in other words, the root, that's good for you. When it's summertime, that's when it's best for you. When it's wintertime, it's not as good for you. So basically, if you eat radish in the summertime, it's healthy for you. So what do we see from this? Not that all vegetables are necessarily healthy according to the Gemara, but that there are vegetables that are extremely healthy, and a Talmid Chacham should live in a place where these are readily available because they are affordable as well as good for your health. And this sounds like a Gemara for Whole Foods to quote in some of its circulars.